This episode brought to you by Discovery Bank. Ready to experience the future of banking now? Get on board. Discovery Bank Limited is an authorized FSP 48657. T's and C's apply. So, you think you want to be a CEO?
It felt like I'm betraying the people that I've worked with, the people whom we've built this massive strategy that we're executing on, and we're definitely delivered some good results, and we're the track record to show. I had to take a step back and say, what is it that ultimately will make me feel fulfilled in the role and the job that I do?
The power, the status, the money.
No one was in a role long enough to be confident to make the call. Everything had to go to a committee. Those who were not part of the committee felt left out, and the committees became bigger and bigger and bigger.
Is it all it's cracked up to be?
Attitude sometimes can trump everything. There are people who are not paralyzed by problems or challenges, who would focus on what is the answer, what is the solution.
Not too many people have gone from being a trade unionist to chief executive of a top-flight bank. Not in many democracies anyway. Today's guest has. Kenny Fihla began his career as a trade unionist in the 1980s. Later, he became a Johannesburg city councillor. In 1995, he ran the finances, upsetting many in the city of Johannesburg, including many in the union movement, which even lobbied for his removal. He later became CEO of Business Against Crime, and in 2006 joined the investment banking division of Standard Bank, and later became the group deputy chief executive to Sim Chabalala. Then the bombshell announcement a little over a year ago. He was leaving as CEO to rival Absa, the fifth to occupy the office since Maria Ramos stepped down in 2019. I'm Bruce Whitfield, and in this series I'm testing what it's really like to be a CEO. So, Kenny Fihla, what does it take to be the Absa CEO?
I think it takes quite a few things. I think the first is the ability to focus on things that matter. There are so many things that demand our attention in any work environment, and one can get lost in the pile of all the problems that we ought to solve. At the end of the day, one needs to have a clear sort of head with regard to things that really matter and make sure that we focus our energies appropriately on those. I think that's the first thing. I think the second is about resilience. I mean, we have to prove ourselves in terms of the work that we do, how we deal with challenges, with complexity, how we manage conflicting interests at times, whether conflicting interests within our own organizations or conflicting interests with regard to various stakeholders. So that resilience and ability to manage complexity is absolutely critical. I think the third is really about knowing that being a CEO or a leader is not about providing all the answers. So it is also about being able to rely on good quality people around you, good leaders surround themselves with exceptional individuals, because through that, they themselves then become exceptional leaders by extension. So in my view, I think it is those three things that are absolutely critical, and goes without saying that one is to demonstrate throughout the process of growing and developing as a manager that we are able to sort of inspire people, we are able to provide hope where there's despair. And organizations go through all sorts of problems and challenges. Good leaders are able to see beyond the problems and beyond the challenges. And that's really the kind of CEO that organizations are looking for.
It's interesting. I mean, all of these terms that you come up with really ring true. And there's a quote from somebody who says, true power means knowing what to ignore. And I think part of leadership is understanding what really matters, as you say up front, and what to ignore. How do you differentiate between what is critical and requires your attention as CEO and what can be dealt with elsewhere?
I mean, I try and look at whether the issue that I need to attend to cuts across different parts of the organization, i.e., am I connecting the dots or am I doing someone else's job? You'll find that in the majority of cases, we tend to do other people's jobs. Then you wonder who's doing your job as the CEO if you are busy doing other people's jobs. And just asking that basic question of whether am I connecting the dots or am I doing someone else's job suddenly things become much more clearer in terms of what you should be focusing on and what you should really be challenging people to deal with and to find answers to. It doesn't mean you absolve yourself of the responsibility to ensure that the job is done and accountability for the results at the end of the day. But it is about knowing how to leverage people within the organization to get things done. Because in the majority of cases, you would find that there are a lot of competent people who are far more knowledgeable on specific aspect of the work, more than you as the CEO. And chances are that they'll be able to get the job done quicker and possibly do it in a manner that is substantially better than you would have if you attempted to do it yourself. So the ability to leverage people around you and make sure that you give the job to the best possible person is part of the trick of being the CEO. So that basic question, am I connecting the dots or am I doing someone else's job, is absolutely critical. I think there's a second issue also that we ought to always try and ask when we engage and deal with issues. Why am I doing this? What's the desired impact and so on? We get so obsessed with all sorts of things because they make us feel important. People come to us for endless meetings with proposals and discussions, and the process becomes, if you like, something that develops a life of its own that occupies us. But when we take a step back and say, but why are we doing this? Then suddenly we realize that actually we're not achieving much, we're not making an impact, and we're not delivering on the outcomes that ultimately the organization ought to deliver on and so on. So I tend to use those two questions just in my own mind, just to help with prioritizing and to help with ensuring that I spend my time in areas where I can make the most impact.
However, outsourcing the critical things that you haven't got time to or don't have the specialization to do requires considerable trust. And many CEOs struggle with that trust, being able to let go completely and put a project, a problem in the hands of an individual. How do you cope with that, particularly being new in an organization, still relatively new? You've just had your first year anniversary at Absa. How have you established that trust and understanding who can and cannot be relied upon?
Well, I've been lucky in that in my career, I've moved into organization and into areas that I was not an expert in, whether it was in the city of Joburg or whether it was business against crime or when I first joined a banking sector. None of those areas were my areas of strength. I had no expertise in them, but I knew how to be a good leader, how to connect the dots. And I was able to focus on that strength to try and unlock the potential of the organizations that I joined. So at the end of the day, you have to look for people. You can see people who are committed. You can track as to who has a track record of delivering and getting things over the line. Secondly, who has the right attitude? Attitude sometimes can trump everything. There are people who are not paralyzed by problems or challenges, who would focus on what is the answer, what is the solution, who are always eager to try and see the positives, even in the most difficult of circumstances, and apply themselves to finding an answer. And those people are not too difficult to find if one spends the time of engaging with people within the organization, try and understand people at a personal level and so on. You'll quickly spot people who are positive, people who are good at problem solving, and people who are always willing to raise their hands to deal with complexity because it helps them to grow. And it also stimulates their own sort of mental faculties and so on. And when you have spotted those people, test them, stretch them, give them responsibilities. Good people will always rise to the top. They'll always prove themselves. They'll always rise to the top. And that's what I found in the majority of cases. It also helps to build trust fairly rapidly. If people feel that they're trusted, that they're given stretch targets, and that you are also vulnerable in your engagements with them to say, you are the expert in the field, I am not. I think we are the better person to lead this project and run with it. Just keep me informed and tell me what are the critical things that you need my support on and so on. Suddenly people say, wow, he's human after all. And therefore, that alone earns a huge amount of trust, and they will go out of their way to ensure that that trust is not broken and is not effectively compromised.
You have brought along with you from your previous job at Standard Bank a clutch of senior executives. Did you therefore find when you arrived that there were obviously gaps in the leadership that needed to be addressed? Or was it a comfort blanket for you to have people with whom you'd previously worked to come in to be your wing people?
I think the number of exceptional individuals within Absa, in fact, most of the people who sit around my exco are people whom I found within Absa. But because those were internal appointments and so on, they effectively were not necessarily noticed, broadly speaking, outside of the organization. But the majority of people who sit around my exco are people who are internal to Absa. And they're exceptional individuals, good in what they do, have the history of the organization, bring a lot of institutional memory, and can help as well in the management of the culture and ensuring that one can deal with internal complexity when it comes to people dynamics and those kind of issues. But there were also challenges in that the repeated changes at a leadership level within Absa, unfortunately, created the hollowing of leadership when it came to some of the business units. Significantly weakened. A lot of people were lost to the organization. Too many acting people in various leadership roles over a very protracted period of time, which then resulted in slow decision-making, inertia, decision by committee, and that created paralysis within the organization. So it was clear that where there were strengths, I definitely needed to protect those and make sure that I retained that talent. But where there were gaps, I think there was no shortcut but to try and bring people who can help me in plugging those gaps so that collectively we can create a leadership team that is equal to the task and that can take this organization to the next level. I think we're at that stage now, given that all the exco roles have been filled, and I think we've got a team that can really create sustainability in the performance of Absa. And we've also brought relatively young people who would also ensure that this leadership has much more longer longevity within Absa and can also help them to build talent so that when it comes to the next appointment of the CEO, the organization does not have to run around and try and find someone, but there should be enough candidates from within who could step up into that role.
What did you make of the Absa culture when you walked in? And I've got legions of stories, of horror stories of some of your predecessors. The first CEO of Absa, and Steve Boyce, and one of the former CEOs, he preceded Maria Ramos, told me the story one day of a guy called Piet Badenhorst, who would get into the lift with people and would see something he didn't like. You're laughing because you've heard the stories too, no doubt. There was one story Steve Boyce told me about a guy who had a ponytail or a mullet or some sort of form of haircut that the CEO didn't like, and the CEO followed him out of the lift on his floor and said, "Take me to your manager," and said to the manager, "If this guy doesn't have a haircut by this time tomorrow, you're going to be fired." Weird cultural anomalies that come from an era of possibly Volkskas and Allied and Trust Bank and all of the components that made up this amalgamation of banks, which some of those characteristics, I believe, still persist in dark corners of the building. What's your assessment of it?
I think the three major cultural shifts that we're trying to drive, and these have been widely canvassed and have also come from the internal survey that we undertook last year. And they relate to the following. I think the first is that the organization is too internally focused. And in many respects, that's because, firstly, we had a command and control culture, which is the example that we are referring to. Then we had the Barclays acquisition where everything was centralized in London. And when Barclays exited, we had then too many changes at a leadership level. So the organization has never had a chance to rebuild a new leadership style post the Barclays exit because of these repeated changes at the leadership level. As a result, a new culture emerged of decision by committee. No one was in a role long enough to be confident to make the call. Everything had to go to a committee. Those who were not part of the committee felt left out, and the committees became bigger and bigger and bigger. And that meant, therefore, that decisions are never taken. People ask for more information, things are deferred, and that just slows the organization down in terms of its ability to make calls and service clients appropriately. So that's the first thing that we're trying to shift, to say we need to move away from being internally focused into being customer or client focused. The second cultural shift is that when you are driven by committees, processes develop a life of their own. And people are very busy running all sorts of processes, writing all sorts of policies and so on, and imposing further bureaucracy onto the organization to a point where there's complete disempowerment of line managers. Everyone looks up for a decision to be made. We visited quite a few branches, our call centers, and regions and countries. And there's a common theme that came out of those engagements. And I'll cite an example of one branch. I asked the branch manager after the town hall and the engagement with the staff there, what are the two things that you'd like changed? She mentioned the first one was, if I lose a teller or a service clerk, I have to wait for head office permission to fill that role. And sometimes it takes 3 months just for me to get an answer, let alone start the process of filling the role. I mean, you can imagine how disempowered that manager must feel, where you can't even fill a role if someone has left the organization. Despite the fact that that's an approved headcount, the role is critical to you being able to service customer. Then customer service deteriorates, your staff is frustrated because suddenly they are overworked and they can't cope with the work that they have to deal with. And it's a lose-lose across all sort of stakeholders. And it is those bureaucratic things that are just so process-driven. And yet you've got people at head office who enjoy that power and who enjoy that because it signals that they are important, that they are making calls, and that they are running the organization. So we want to shift that completely from being process-driven into being outcomes-driven. What are we trying to do? We're trying to make sure that we appoint competent people, that managers take ownership and responsibility for their branches or their functions, their areas. What are the parameters that we need to set for them to be able to do so effectively and in a manner that is ethical? And let's set those parameters and empower them to act within those parameters. If something goes wrong or someone does not follow the rules, we'll deal with that person. But we can't paralyze the entire organization because we're paranoid about 0.1% of the people doing something wrong. So we'll rather shut everything down and centralize that decision-making to some obscure committee at head office. So that's the second shift that we want to make. The third, and this came from as we engage with our sort of leadership, broadly speaking, outside of EXCO, where people were saying we're also a bit tolerant of poor performance. And it's not surprising. If you run the organization and make decisions by committee, you can't hold anyone accountable. And consequently, poor performers will thrive in that kind of environment. It becomes too political. It means politicians survive better because they're able to manage the committee processes and they're able to influence decision makers who are not really responsible for ensuring that they manage and they can hold them accountable. So we want to shift that into a culture of confidence, a culture of winning, and a culture of accountability and so on. And I think we're starting to make some progress. I can see the shift in the tone, the excitement in how people engage with us, just the excitement in our own employees, as well as the excitement even outside of Absa. Suddenly, Absa is being looked at as a potential employer by many other players in the financial sector, which is something that didn't exist, say, about 2 or 3 years ago.
Stability is absolutely critical in this process. I mean, Maria Ramos was there for 10 years, very much command and control. There were interim CEOs, there were part-time CEOs, there were acting CEOs, there were outsiders and insiders, most famously, of course, Daniel Manele, who came from the Reserve Bank into COVID, which must have been the most dreadful experience, and sort of remotely managing a business to which he was new remotely. He left and he's now doing a great job as the chairman of Nedbank, poaching a guy who may have thought he should be the next CEO of Absa, Jason Quinn, to then run Nedbank, and he's doing a good job there. Stability and culture are so important to this thing. And you mentioned earlier that the job of the CEO is to inspire and bring hope. What is the line between inspiration, hope, and delusion? Because so often you get the rah-rah of the CEO, which doesn't match the lived experience of teams on the ground. How do you manage that gap, which must have existed quite considerably on the day you arrived?
I think the first thing is to acknowledge, what the strengths that the organization has and use that to inspire people. And I've described Absa when I was engaging with people in my sort of first couple of months as a sleeping giant. Excellent client base. I mean, despite all the challenges that it has experienced in the last couple of years, amazing clients, whether it's retail clients, business banking, or even large corporates and so on. Still very loyal and amazing institutions. Exceptional individuals in many places and in many of the geographies that I have visited. We have exceptional leaders and amazing managers and so on. But because of the culture of paralysis, even that talent did not really rise to the to the top, i.e., people tended then to play by the rules that they thought would keep them safe, because no one wanted to stick their necks out in the event that it gets chopped because you're doing something that is unpopular or that is not liked by the power that might be, and so on. So they're amazing people. And thirdly, I think the opportunity is still massive out there. If only we can deal with some of the internal issues that have held back the institution. So the hope really that one is giving to the organization is not just a pipe dream. It is based on the competitive strength that I think Absa has, the amazing client base, the strength of its own people, and the fact that most of the shortcomings that it has experienced in the last couple of years were effectively own goals. Just showing people that by speeding up decision-making, by empowering managers and removing the bureaucracy, by shifting our focus from being too process-driven and internally focused into being client-focused, we think there's a lot that we can play for. There are a number of examples that I've given to the team where I've visited customers and discovered that we only do one or two things with those customers. Mainly, we lend to them, but we don't do anything else. When I ask some of the customers, but why is it that we've taken so much risk on you? And quite frankly, more than any other bank, we've got the biggest share of your borrowing. But you give all the other business that is relatively juicier, the cherry on top to other banks and so on. The answer in the majority of cases would be, but you never asked for it. Now, that's a low-hanging fruit, which suggests then that the orientation has been to go for the path of least resistance. And lending is always the path of least resistance because, as you know, Bruce, everyone wants cheap money from the bank. And therefore, you don't have to fight hard to effectively lend and increase your asset book, but you have to fight hard to win the other business. It is highly competitive and so on. So just demonstrating and showing to people that we're leaving money on the table because we're not having the right client conversation. And then to try and identify what is it that needs to be done for our people to be properly skilled, to build the confidence so that they can start to chase the ancillary business over and above us lending to clients. And we're starting to see some green shoots. And all it takes is a few wins for people to believe in themselves and to start to see that, wow, this ambition of waking up this giant and reclaiming our dominant position is actually achievable if we just do these right things on a consistent basis.
From the start, the ambition was clear: to build a bank that could be more than a bank. One that rewards better decisions, connects the ecosystems that shape your life, and gets smarter the more you engage. That ambition is now a reality. With Discovery Bank, your entire financial life comes together in one intelligent platform, accessed through a single app. It understands your behavior, works harder for you over time, and helps you build your financial future with confidence. Discovery Bank, the future of banking. Now.
You have a perfectly comfortable life as a deputy chief executive of Standard Bank. You'd joined the bank 18 years previously in the investment banking division. You'd come from business against crime. You'd previously been in charge of Joburg City finances. Before that, you were in the trade union movement. I think you're probably the only trade unionist to rise to the top of a big five bank in South Africa. What was the attraction of the task?
I think it was two things. I think the first, I was not looking for anything, but when Silo, the then chairman, approached me, and I said, now let me think about it and look at Absa and do a bit of research. And as I was doing that, it became quite apparent that this organization has so much potential and has so many strengths, but for whatever reason, the strengths have not been leveraged appropriately to capture this potential that is right in front of Absa as an institution. If you look at the size of the asset books of the top three banks, Absa is up there. And the gap between number 1, 2, and 3 is so narrow that anyone can be number 1. So clearly, this is still a good quality institution. But when it comes to crowding in the ancillary revenue, the gap starts to widen, which suggests then that there's something that the organization was not doing right to be able to unlock this additional value. And I saw that as a big opportunity because I've been able to do that in my past roles in my previous employer, where I took over businesses that had massive strengths, but there were certain shortcomings that prevented them from capitalizing on those strengths to effectively grow, win market share, and be number 1, and was able to drive until we achieved number 1. So I knew that it can be done because I've done it before. Then there's the second reason, and that my previous boss and I are more or less the same age. And he was not going anywhere, which meant then we were going to retire at more or less the same time. So I needed to make a choice. Do I stay in my cushy job until I retire, or do I want to take one more big challenge, apply all that I've learned, and possibly leave a positive legacy of having unlocked a massive potential in an institution like Absa and leave it at a place where I think it can be competing for being the number 1 bank in South Africa and possibly in the African continent. And there was no really comparison between the two choices. I still believe I've got energy, I've got a lot to offer, and so on. Maybe if my health was a bit frail and I thought my energy levels were waning, I would have said, no, thanks, I'd rather stay where I am. But I still feel that I've got value to add and to contribute. And a contribution that one can make at Absa, I think, can leave a positive legacy if appropriately executed on and if it is done consistently.
But leaving Standard Bank to go to Absa is a bit like a player swapping Chiefs for Pirates or Man City for United. The fans are not always going to be massively supportive of a move like that. Was it a tricky conversation? Hey, Sim, I've been offered this job. I've done some research. I'm leaving. It's been a little bit awkward.
It was. I mean, I think leaving organizations is usually not about the organization itself, because the organization is just a thing. But it is about the people, the relationships that have been built, the culture that one was part of building and formulating, some of the people that I've gotten very, very close to, either because they were colleagues or because I was mentoring them or providing some coaching and so on. So it is that emotion that is the most difficult thing to deal with and so on. So it was not easy from an emotional point of view in terms of it felt like I'm betraying the people that I've worked with, the people whom we've built this massive strategy that we're executing on, and we're definitely delivered some good results, and we had a track record to show. But at the end of the day, I had to take a step back and say, but what is it that ultimately will make me feel fulfilled in the role and the job that I do? And if I weigh these two options, and forget about the emotion, because I'm not hurting anyone. I mean, I'm not betraying anyone. We all joined an organization wanting to make a difference. So if I just apply pure logic and common sense, which of these two options is the most appropriate? And I guess the rational part in me made it easier for me to overcome the emotional separation and to deal with it in a manner that I thought was the most appropriate.
Are you still on good terms with your former colleagues, or is there a sense of that betrayal you mentioned? I mean, people do get very protective about their spaces.
I think we're still in good terms. We chat every now and then. We have to talk about industry-related issues and so on. Are there people who are still grumpy? Absolutely. But we're all grown up, I'm sure.
If they weren't, you would. I think it would be more offensive, actually, if people weren't slightly hurt by the fact that you'd left. You mentioned earlier a bugbear is endless meetings, and you hate being stuck in endless meetings. And often the life of a CEO appears you're not in control of your own diary. You have an executive assistant who at the beginning of each week or at the end of each day tells you what's going to be happening the next day, and your diary is set for you because there are the requirements. You have to show face, you have to show support, you have to inquire, you have to go not only where there are problems, but where there's great success. How do you combat meeting fatigue?
A rule that I've tried to apply and enforce as much as I can i.e. that I need to spend close to 30% of my time with clients. It doesn't matter whether they're retail clients or large corporate clients or institutional clients and so on. So that's the first rule. And if I don't see client meetings in any week, I get worried. And I asked, why is it that there are no client issues and so on? Are we engaging with the businesses? Are there problems? Are there pitches that are being made and so on? So that helps. I mean, I find that engaging outside of the organization is the most satisfying part of the job because you can engage and understand the impact of the decisions that we make. If we provide a home loan to someone, they are able to build a home and provide shelter for their families. If we are able to fund the expansion of the production capacity of the company, you can actually see when that factory has been expanded and the impact that it would have in terms of job creation, improved profitability, and a growing economy. So that's the most satisfying part of the role. And I always insist that I should spend at least 30% of my time. I don't always get there in every single week, but I think I'm spending enough and adequate time in front of the clients. And my PA knows very well that any client issue ought to be prioritized above internal meeting, unless if it is an internal meeting that I can't get out of or can't be moved. I think the second is really being conscious of what are the key issues that I want to personally take an interest in, and ensure that those are effectively inserted in the diary in a much more structured sort of kind of way, fairly deliberate, so that we need to touch base on this specific issue every second week or every 3 weeks or every month. When you do that, you start to create a structure for your own diary so that all the other additional things that come in at least come around that structure that you would have created, which helps you to focus on things that matter and not just be ad hoc and run all over the show and so on. Of course, there are things that we can't get out of, things that we have to do. There are board cycles, there are routines that ought to be processed, i.e. management committees looking at those, board subcommittees, and ultimately the board. There's interaction with the regulators that is an absolute must, because we also have to ensure that regulators are on site and are aligned in terms of their own thinking with our own thinking and understanding of the business and where the pain points are and so on. And likewise, there's a whole range of other external stakeholders that we have to engage with. So I have to every now and then ask the question, if I look back in the last month or two, have I spent enough time touching base with all critical stakeholders? And what was the objective of those engagements? And do I think I've made the impact that was desired and so on? And then review with my peer and make sure that we recalibrate as we think about the next round of meetings and so on. One has to be deliberate and conscious about these things. But you're absolutely right. Our days and our work is determined by others. When there's no one in the office, it feels very lonely and very quiet because you can only read so much. You can only draft so much, so many documents and so on. So we need people in order to perform, which is why, having good people around you is an absolute must. Without that, we're not solo producers.
You do seem hugely energized by the challenge and getting a grip on it. It takes a long time to get your feet under the desk and to truly grasp the nettle of an organization and to get people to be honest enough and trust you enough to be able to share real issues within the business, particularly in a place that has got a reputation for being fairly punitive for raising issues. How much time have you committed to Absa? Because you joined Absa a year ago. Sims is stepping down next year at some point. You could have succeeded him had the dice rolled in your favor. This opportunity came up sooner than that. Have you given them a full 5-year commitment, or what is that? What are the terms of your engagement?
And I've given Absa my full commitment that I will probably stay until their retirement age, which is 63. And I intend to keep that promise. I'm not going to betray sort of Absa. So it is a 5-year commitment, yes, that I've given to the organization. And yes, Sim is retiring next year. But before I left Standard Bank, that would have been my retirement period as well.
Okay. On that retirement age, on that retirement day, how will you objectively measure your success? What do you need to achieve between now and then to say, that was a good move, that was worthwhile, I'm so glad I did it?
I think there are a few things that I would want to see by the time I leave Absa. I think the first is the obvious one, that there are certain medium-term financial targets that we should deliver. But I think numbers on their own, important as they are, mean very sort of little. One is to ensure that there are certain things that will ensure the sustainability in the performance of the organization. And I think the first relates to ensuring that there's proper leadership, that there's proper depth, and that there's embedded succession planning. I think that has been one of the Achilles heels of this organization. Too many changes to a point where nothing was really executed on a sustained basis over a period of time, which then disempowers people, creates start-stop, is demoralizing, and ultimately puts the organization at a disadvantage. So I would want that to be properly fixed, i.e. proper depth of leadership, clarity of thought as to what the priorities are, and consistent execution behind that. That's the first thing around people, because I think that's absolutely important for this organization. I think the second is about creating the step change. If I look at where Absa is today and the businesses that it does, there is no doubt that we can take this to the next level in terms of the relative contribution of all three businesses. CIB has been carrying Absa for quite some time with an underperformance in the retail business and business banking business. I would want to see these two businesses being equal contributors to the performance of Absa and having stepped up quite significantly, which is why fixing the people element was absolutely critical. And I think we're starting to get closer to that being effectively sorted out so that we can start then to extract value and drive organizational performance, even when it comes to those two businesses. I think the third is that I think we would want Absa, we say we want to be a leading sort of a Pan-African bank. We operate in 14 geographies. In those geographies, our dominant business is CIB. I would want to see Absa being dominant in more than 12 sort of African markets, effectively operating in all the major financial markets of Africa and being a significant player in those and so on. And I think there are ways of getting there, but we have to take the baby steps and make sure that we're consistent in the things that we do, and we do them over a protracted period of time and so on. And I have no doubt in my mind that we can get there and we can achieve all three of these things.
I asked Mteto Nyati, I said, what's the one thing, if you distilled it down to the barest essence, what's the one thing that brought change at Eskom? And we threw it around a bit, and eventually it came down to restoring employees in Eskom self-belief that they had it within their means to turn around Eskom. They'd given up, the country had given up, the politicians had given up, everybody, they'd given up on themselves within Eskom to find solutions to the problems of energy supply. That has been a fundamental shift, and I wonder if the success of Absa will hinge on the self-belief internally of the people who are there, because they seem to have lost that self-belief for quite some time, that they could go from number 5 or 6 in the banking pile and rise up the ranks.
I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that self-belief is absolutely key, but it's dependent on leadership. The role of leaders, firstly, is to ensure that we appoint good quality people. And then secondly is to, when I said give people hope, it is not false hope. It is to unlock, the sense of self-belief by demonstrating that certain things can be done and they are achievable. And when people have done interesting things and they've had the first win, the second win, the third win, winning is addictive. Before you know it, everyone wants to win. And then there's internal competition within the organization, not a negative one, fighting over position, but everyone, when I want to be the next person who celebrated for having closed this deal. I want my business unit to be the one that's mentioned on our internal newsletter as having outperformed and so on. We also want our people to be selected on the excellent awards of people who would be praised and probably taken on a holiday elsewhere by the organization. You start to have a healthy competition that is about delivering value, achieving targets, and making a huge customer impact. And when we get there, we will know, because we will feel the energy, we will feel the competition, and we'll also see it with the performance of the organization. Interestingly, when we talk to people as we visit various parts of the organization, further down the organization, people know what needs to be done. I was giving an example of a branch manager who said, only if I can be allowed to make the decisions that are appropriate for my branch, There's no reason why I can't win. And by the way, she gave a second example. She said all the other banks are closing their branches at 4:30. I close mine at 3:30. I said, but why aren't you changing yours to 4:30 as well? She said, no, I've engaged with my own staff. They are more than happy to have a two staggered team, one coming in at 8:30, because it's fairly quiet for the first 2 hours of the morning, and then the majority of the people coming in 1.5 hours later so that we can close at 4:30. And I know exactly that if I do that, I'll be able to increase my customer numbers and will service people as they knock off from work from within this mall. And I said, it's a no-brainer, do it. I said, no, but I've been told I can't do it by someone at head office. I said, why? I said, that's policy. So people know, what needs to be done in order for them to win. And they believe that if they are able to do and tweak certain things, they'll be able to outcompete and effectively increase their market share. But unfortunately, we tend to hold them back. We tend to impose restrictions because of some obscure policies, obscure procedures that just do not make functional sense at all.
That's Kenny Fihla, the CEO of Absa. Sometimes an opportunity comes along that's just too good to resist. Loyalty is one thing. The opportunity to have real impact, however, is another. And seizing the day is absolutely core to this episode. Build trust fast, get the right people into the right jobs and back them to back themselves. It cuts down on the interminable meetings and builds agency in a big institution. Command and control is so last century. And that brings an end to this first series. We hope it's a first series. So You Think You Want to Be a CEO. Thank you for listening. If you missed some episodes, go back into the catalogue and have a listen. Share these with your friends. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to season 2. Crossed fingers, we hope.
This episode of So You Think You Want to Be a CEO is powered by Discovery Bank. Discovery Bank is an authorized FSP 48657. T's and C's apply.